We're approaching the biggest news week of the year, with the Federal Reserve making a pivotal interest rate decision. Because of this, we wanted to check in on some key levels for the S&P 500, along with the history of what happened the last 7 times the Fed cut rates when the markets were at all-time highs.
The U.S. markets rebounded nicely last week after their worst week since May, as the Russell 2000 and the NASDAQ were both up over 2%, the S&P 500 was up 1.66%, and the Dow Jones was barely positive. Now, the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are both up over 20% for the year. Foreign and emerging markets were both negative last week, with foreign markets down about 0.25%, and emerging markets were down 0.75%. But both foreign and emerging markets, both positive still, over 10% year to date. We're looking at a chart of the S&P 500 today, right before the Federal Reserve makes their decision on interest rates. And if you're looking at the chart here, you can see that in July, the S&P 500 broke out above the thick blue line and made all-time highs. Now, right after the S&P 500 made their all-time highs in July, the following week, we saw a back test back down to that blue line. But what happened next is that the market bounced right off that blue line and continued to make new all-time highs, which is exactly what the bulls wanted. If the market likes what the Federal Reserve decides to do with interest rates, we could continue to see the S&P 500 run higher and continue to make all-time highs. But if the market doesn't like what the Federal Reserve decides to do here at the end of the month, there are 3 levels to the downside that we're looking at. First is that thick blue breakout line, and that's about 2% away from where we are currently. Next, there are 2 thin lines in the middle of the chart. First is the 50-day moving average, which is about 3.5% away from the current level. And last is the 200-day moving average, which is just under 7% away from where the S&P 500 currently is. So depending on what the Federal Reserve decides to do, we could potentially see some big moves higher or lower this week.
With everyone expecting the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates this upcoming week, we wanted to take a look back through history to see if there was any precedence for this. Has the Federal Reserve ever cut interest rates while the markets were at all-time highs? And we were surprised to find that this has happened 7 other times. Now, the first time the Fed did this was back in October of 1982, and they cut rates by 0.5%. And then they proceeded to cut rates again in November of 1982 as the market continued to sell off, and it was down 5.3% in just 1 month. And then they cut rates again in 1986 while the markets were at all-time highs. And again they cut by 0.5%. Now, in July of 1986, they cut again as the markets sold off and were down by 3.9% during that time. Now, there was another instance of this happening in July of 1989, but I wanted to focus on what happened when they cut rates July of 1990. And the Fed cut rates by 0.25%. But over the next 3 months, the market sold off by over 17%, and they were forced to cut rates again in October. Now, there were 2 more instances of this occurring in 91 and 95, and the market proceeded to pull back just a little bit. Now, the last time that the Federal Reserve cut interest rates while the markets were at all-time highs was 1996, and they cut rates by 0.25%. And this time was the only time out of the last 7 where the markets were positive and rallied into the next rate cut. And they rallied by over 30%. Now, it's extremely important to note that the Federal Reserve has never cut interest rates while the markets were at all-time highs and unemployment was under 4%. So this will be the first time in history. Not only does the US have a big interest rate decision coming this week, but also the Bank of England and Bank of Japan do as well.
Also, the U.S. trade team is flying over to China to resume trade negotiations, and that starts on Tuesday. So investors will be interested to see if there are any developments on that front.
Thanks for watching, and if you're on Facebook, please like and share our video, and if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel.